School zones are set for a major shake-up as part of sweeping education reforms unveiled today. Individual schools will no longer set their own enrolment policies. It'll be done by a network of regional offices set up by the Ministry of Education to ensure more equitable access to schooling. The government's final report found competition under tomorrow's schools has exacerbated ethnic and socio-economic segregation. Education Minister Chris Hipkins explained how the new zoning system will work.
As the population explodes in some parts of the country, we really are struggling at the moment to keep up with that. Some school enrolment zones are shrinking, and we've got to actually do a better job of this if we're going to make sure that every kid can attend their local school.
So what problem exactly are you trying to fix by giving the power over this policy to this new education service agency network?
Look, this is about keeping up with population growth. It's about making sure that we've got enough space in our schools and that we're using the space that we've got in our schools so that schools don't become overcrowded, so that we're managing how we cope with that population growth, so that we're expanding schools where we need to expand them, building new schools where we need to. The reality, though, is some of those schools can't expand. They're at their physical, constraint. They just don't have enough space to take on more students. So we do have to realise that enrolment zones and enrolment schemes are here to stay, because without them, we couldn't cope in some areas with the population growth.
But it's not just about, it's about socio-economic segregation as well, isn't it? And ethnic segregation, according to this report.
Well, I think that kind of happens to some extent by who can afford to live in a particular community. But the reality is that how you deal with out-of-zone placements, I think that's where the concern comes about, schools cherry-picking the most able kids and so on. The reality is that actually there's a pretty robust system in place now to stop schools from doing that, and we're not changing that. So schools do have a criteria that they go through for out-of-zone places. So if they've got space for, say, 1,000 kids at a school, 800 kids living within their zone, there's 200 places that are available for other kids, and there's a process they go through to allocate those places, and we're not changing that part of the process. But how the zone is drawn, that part of the process is changing.
Well, in terms, I want to get to out-of-zone children, talk about that a little bit more shortly, but it's kind of lucky you're not in the real estate business, isn't it, Minister? Because you would be aware there's this whole economy that operates around zones, doesn't it? You probably just knocked off a couple of $100K from the Grammar Zone in Auckland with this announcement.
No, I don't think that's true. Look, I think the reality, though, is if you look at places like in central Auckland, some of those enrolment zones would be shrinking regardless of what government does, because the reality is, there's a lot of urban intensification in that area, and so there's going to be a need for us to look at how we manage that, and of course zones are going to be part of that. We can't expand schools indefinitely to take on more and more students. We do actually in some cases have to build new schools, and we've got to make better use of the schools that we've got that are underutilised.
So what level of pushback are you expecting, or actually are you making it easier for schools by taking this away from them? They're not faced with all that politics with the families and parents.
Look, some schools won't like this, but I think a number of schools will say, actually, we'd rather not have to deal with this because it is a political hot potato for them. It puts schools into conflict with one another, when they're talking about, that community, is it in your zone or our zone? And it does create tension amongst schools. The Ministry of Education, at the end of the day, they already approve the zones now, so it's not really shifting the balance of power in that regard, but it is putting a better process around how the zones are developed in the first place.
National says you're taking away parents' choice with this, are you?
Well, I think having zones in the first place does take away a degree of parental choice, but I don't think that any government is going to say that we wouldn't have zones. National did try that once, and having tried it for a period of time, they were the government that reintroduced the zones because it didn't work.
So in terms of out-of-zone kids, how are you going to discourage schools from taking excessive numbers of out-of-zone kids?
Well, I mean, schools have capacity constraints, and actually what you're seeing in some of those schools in Auckland now is they're getting to the point where they won't have any out-of-zone kids because of that urban intensification. They're going to be using up every available space they have to accommodate kids who live within their local community.
But Minister, there will be schools who are cherry-picking kids who have great academic records, or they'd be fantastic for the rugby team.
So, like I said, I'm actually quite confident that there are good systems in place now, and they were the same systems that were in place under the last government, that do stop schools from doing that. So it's a ballot process. So, it's not cherry picking. Basically, if people want to enrol their child for one of those out-of-zone places, their names are quite literally drawn out of a hat. Now, there are some exceptions to that. So there are some criteria around if you've already got a sibling at the school and things like that. But actually, it doesn't allow for a lot of cherry picking now.
So what about potentials for caps for out-of-zone kids, and also different funding models for out-of-zone kids?
I think we're not proposing any different funding models for out-of-zone kids, although what we do say with out-of-zone kids now is that we don't fund additional property for more out-of-zone kids. That's not changing. That's a long-standing policy that's been in place under several governments, and I think we're going to keep that policy in place. So the biggest cap really is a school's physical capacity to accommodate out-of-zone kids. And if they are at capacity, then they won't be taking a lot of out-of-zone kids, because we're certainly not going to fund them to expand to take out-of-zone kids.
Do you think that having regional zones decided by someone else, is this meaning that you're going to have to spend less on building programs? You're just going to fill up the empty classrooms in schools that have space and better utilise the space that's available?
I think the reality is we've actually got to do both. So in areas where the population's growing fast, we both need to build more classrooms and more schools, and we need to make better use of the school facilities that are available. So it's not an either-or choice. Actually, we've got to do both of those things.
And that was Education Minister Chris Hipkins.